Can you explain what ghosts actually are?
Asking for what ghosts are is a kind of a broad question. Let's just say we can define what we mean when we're talking about ghosts. And unfortunately, that in itself is a tough question because in different cultures, the word ghost means different things. But generally, when people use the term ghost, what we in parapsychology would use the term apparition. A ghost or an apparition is the consciousness of a human being that has survived the death of their body and is capable of interaction. And I'll also add to that that sometimes it can be pets. So it's not only humans, it can be pets as well, animals as well. But generally, the key is that there's an interaction between this consciousness without a body and us living folks. Also included in apparitions in that category, we have apparitions of living people that are perceived and the apparitions that are seen by people on their deathbed. So it's not just limited to discarnate or deceased people in that way.
And besides apparitions, are there other things that fall into the category of ghosts?
Commonly, and I guess with pop culture, people use the word ghost to refer to any figure that they see, any movements that they experience that seem to be out of the ordinary or bizarre or unexplainable. And we make a distinction. Even in the amateur ghost hunter world, there is a distinction made between those conscious entities, what we call apparitions, which I know are called intelligent ghosts. We don't like to use that phrase because, unfortunately, not every human being is intelligent. So conscious is more important, interactive. Intelligence doesn't mean that. Then there are hauntings, or what is commonly referred to as a residual haunting, or place memory, or perhaps a psychic imprint. And that is the images, the sounds, smells, feelings, emotions that living people leave behind in places and sometimes in objects. And us living folks can pick this up. We pick it up psychically or possibly biologically. There's a couple different models that we're working from when we talk about this. But the key element is that when people see something in a haunting, that is a recorded pattern, and it will typically repeat itself over and over again, whereas an apparition is interactive, like a human being would be. And the other thing that's really important is that the dead do not leave recordings. It's the living that leave the recordings, not the dead. In the same way that a 1930s movie, almost everybody, if not everyone in that film that was shot when they were all alive, they're all dead now, but the recording was made when they were alive. We can still watch it, but they're not there anymore. They just made it when they were alive. And that's a really key distinction. Death does not follow hauntings. The third area is often called poltergeists. There's a lot of bad information about this. And there are actually even slightly two different ways that we would use this term in parapsychology psychical research, depending on the continent. Actually, in the UK and Europe, they use it slightly differently or at a different starting point than we do in the US and Canada. If there's physical activity and no other sign of spirit activity, like there's nothing else happening, there's no interaction, there's no way to determine that there's any consciousness there, no psychics or mediums are picking up spirits, it's just purely physical activity, we would use the term poltergeist or the phrase recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, because these have been tied to living people, to the unconscious minds of the living in the environment, not to the dead, not to spirits whatsoever. If a ghost moves something, if an apparition moves something, that's apparitional mind over matter or apparitional PK. In the United Kingdom and Europe, they would use the term poltergeist if there's any physical activity, and then split it out to living agent PK, meaning recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or apparitional PK under that poltergeist umbrella. We just kind of step back from that a little bit in the get-go. The really active poltergeist cases, which are typically chaotic, with physical objects moving, could be water effects, could be minor fire effects, there could be a lot of electronic effects. That happens quite a bit these days. They come from living people. And again, what we look at is also whether or not there's any indication that there could be an apparition or a ghost present. And we don't find any of that in the majority of poltergeist cases. And as soon as we do find that, and we link the movement to the ghost, then we would shift it out of the poltergeist label or category. There are ghosts that can move things, and there are cases where there's activity caused by a living person and there's also a ghost. In fact, sometimes the stress the person has who's causing the activity comes from him or her having a scare after meeting the ghost. So we have to really kind of separate these things out in order to understand what we're trying to get to the point where we're trying to study something. Our first rule is always to eliminate the normal and then figure out which bucket or which approach we need to take to the case based on the evidence. And sometimes all three things, apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists, can be in the same location, but not every event ties to only one of those things. We have to separate each one of them.
I think most of people are very interested in what we call the conscious apparitions, the ones that can interact. And I was wondering if you could tell us some kind of compelling stories that you've had in the field where even skeptics would scratch their heads at if you told them.
I can tell you about a couple of them. And of course, skeptics will scratch their head, but they'll just right off the bat say that I'm either lying or making it up, or the witnesses are making it up, or we're all delusional, or it's mass hallucination. People who call themselves skeptics are rarely actually skeptics. They're usually disbelievers, and they won't even consider the possibility. So I actually really don't care what they think anymore. But I've had two really good cases. One was relatively early in my career, and it's actually written up in Leslie Kane's book, Surviving Death, the full chapter on this particular case. And this was a case in Livermore, California in '85, where a family was not afraid of the ghost that they were seeing, but only had come to realize that they were all seeing the ghost separately, just not talking to each other. And their 12-and-a-half-year-old son was having daily conversations with her. The mother who called me was just simply concerned that her son would or would not grow up to be a normal teenager, talking to a ghost every day. Had no fear of this woman, though, of the ghost. So the investigation pretty much focused on two main things. One was interviews with the witnesses, and especially with the boy. And two, fact-checking the information we got from this kid, which he said he was getting from the ghost. So we were able to track down the only living relative of the woman, and the family stories we were told through this boy from the ghost, Lois, did all check out. And there were no diaries or anything like that. By the way, the woman who was the ghost did not die in the house. That's a misconception. She actually died in the hospital. So she just went back to her house because that's where she had the closest tie since she'd been born in the house and lived there all of her life. The other thing that was really interesting about that case is during our discussions with the boy and Lois, the ghost, who was talking to Chris, the boy, we were asked questions about why are you here? Why didn't you move on? What are you? I mean, how come some people can see you and some people can't? Why do you change your clothes all the time? She was actually seen in different ages for that matter. And we got answers or responses that in 1985, it would have been very hard to find any book that really addressed this because they were all out of print and almost impossible to find from much earlier in the century or the late 1900s, late 1800s rather. And what we heard was, number one, when she died or when she was dying, she did a life review. She wasn't religious, so she didn't believe in heaven or hell, but she figured, why take a chance? She just wanted to go home. So she really purposely wanted to go back to her home. And when she closed her eyes, she said, at least that's what Chris said, the message we got was that she found herself in her living room and stayed there until the new people came in. The other thing was, she said that as far as she knew, she was just some kind of energy. And how she thought of herself on a given day was what the people she tried to connect with would see or hear. So she could think of herself with different clothing on. She could think of herself as an old woman or a young woman. And that's how the witnesses would actually pick her up. And that has shown out or proven out in almost all of our cases over the years. And certainly in the historical cases that we have and the backlog of reports we have over the more than 140 years this field's been around.
If I recall, there was a story about her being scared of you and being in the car
Yeah.
Can you tell, that was a cute story. Can you tell that story again?
When we were called by Pat, by the mother in this case, originally at JFK, it's back when we had our graduate parapsychology program. And our faculty and students would do the investigations. And I took the call. And as I'm hearing a little bit about the case from Pat and about her son and everything going on, this was early 1985. And Pat said to me, Chris says that it's really important you don't bring any of the stuff from Ghostbusters, no ghost traps and things like that. because Lois was worried about that. Apparently Lois would watch TV with Chris and saw a commercial for Ghostbusters, and he had seen Ghostbusters also. So we, I promised that was the case. So one of the questions we actually got when we were sitting there in the living room with Pat, her mom, and Chris, and an empty chair was whether we have this equipment or not. And I made a kiddingly, a real joking statement that, the proton pack, which I could not possibly have because the Spirit Superstores didn't exist, the Halloween stores didn't exist, like the one behind me right now. I kiddingly said, well, they leak nuclear radiation, so we have no insurance for that, so we don't carry this around. Got a big laugh out of that. I had come down to the house in Livermore from Orinda, where JFK was at the time. At the time, it was my wife at the time, so my ex-wife now. My wife at the time was with me. One of our graduate students, who was also the actual receptionist for the school, he was a transpersonal counseling student and also had been taking a bunch of parapsychology courses, so he came as well. And we drove down, and as we're driving down to Livermore, which is about a 40-minute drive, my old, slightly old car, which I was going to replace, generated a conversation about the new car we're going to be looking at. And then Joanna talked about how she was about to quit her job as a secretary at a law firm. And Kip, who had been out of school for a number of years, I asked him what he'd been doing between college and grad school. And he said, well, he was a professional dancer in Hollywood for television programs, which was kind of cool. So I didn't know that about him. So we have this really interesting conversation. We get down there, we go through the investigation, we sit down, we have these conversations. And then at the very end of our conversation about Lois, I asked, so does Lois have any questions for us? Do you have any questions for us, Chris? He looks over at the empty chair, he turns back and he says, Loyd, what kind of new car do you want? Joanna, do you really want to quit your job? And Kip, how long were you a dancer in LA? And we were dumbfounded. We absolutely did not say a word about these topics when we walked in the house. I had a recorder going. We did not say anything about this. The only possibility was either something on the paranormal side or they bugged my car. And given the circumstances, not that I checked my car over completely, but given the circumstances, this was not a case they wanted publicity. In fact, at the time, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't care if we talked about it, as long as we didn't identify them and their house. But this was not, there's no motive for this. So I said, well, how does Lois know to ask us these questions? And Chris said she was a little worried about the Ghostbuster stuff. So she went to the university and she sat in the back of your car and listened in on your conversation on the way down. And Kip at that point turned a little green because he'd been sitting in the back seat of the car, realizing there was a ghost sitting next to him, which he didn't realize in the drive. And we all laughed about the whole thing. I never, at the time, and even after that, I didn't even think till many years later to ask how she got to Orinda. Now, we know that ghosts can travel without any motive needs, but it would have been kind of a funny, I'm sure we would have gotten a funny answer. The other case, which I have to say is really unique, is in some respects, is the USS Hornet aircraft carrier museum. And in that case, I was brought in that case just after the museum opened in 1998 by Stash Margaret Murray, who was a psychic who had already been working with folks on the ship. She was already a docent. She was already working with the board of the Hornet and the foundation people and a couple of people working on the ship. It was already collecting stories. She had seen the ghosts. She had been collecting witness testimony. And so she brought us aboard to work with everyone to really do a better job of investigating and asking whether or not this was real from a scientific perspective. And we talked to dozens and dozens of witnesses in 98, 99, and 2000. Folks who worked on the ship, a couple people who lived aboard the ship, foundation people. We talked to docents, we talked to visitors. We talked to a lot of people, all who had coherent stories that checked out, and many of which actually had multiple witnesses, which was the really unique thing about this. There are a number of situations where you have many people seeing the same thing or hearing the same thing at the same time. Based on witness descriptions, it would be hard to identify most of the ghosts. The ship does have a backlog of photographs, but there were 3,000 people aboard the ship at any one time. So the only folks who were identified were higher profile apparitions, I guess you could say. J.J. Clark, who retired as an admiral. He was commander aboard the ship during World War II. And he was definitely very present, according to Stosh and every other psychic or medium we brought in, and based on descriptions of some of the witnesses. There was a pastor who was a minister who was actually aboard the ship during the chaplain during World War II, who was identified. There were some good separate pictures of him. And there were a couple of other people that were identified from photographs, but for the most part, there's no way to do it based on thousands of faces that would be in a mug book for someone. But it was a really great case because the witness testimony correlated even across time. In other words, over the years, there were some people who saw the exact same people and they interacted. There was a definite interaction factor with these pieces. And some of the witnesses were actually absolute disbelievers, and a number of them were just middle of the road. In fact, one of the leading witnesses of a couple of really good examples, Alan McCain, who was the curator of the museum at the time, and a former Navy SEAL, witnessed one of the apparitions with a potential sponsor for the ship's foundation. They both saw him. He looked fairly solid. He vanished. When I asked Alan, what do you think of that? He says, I don't know what to think of it. All I can tell you is what I saw. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or not, but this was real. And that's a good attitude, actually. One of the stories related to us was that a group of the security guys and a couple of docents were actually it was a Christmas time. This is before the museum actually opened up. And they had a Christmas tree down on the hangar deck. And they were up on the flight deck. They came down from the flight deck. Admittedly, they had a few beers, but they came down from the flight deck, and it was a group, if I recall, I don't remember if it was seven offhand, whether it was 7 people or more. I think it was actually more than 7 people. They came down onto the hangar bay deck, and they were looking at the Christmas tree, and there's a guy standing there in a Navy pea coat, kind of circa 1940s. And they all looked at each other. Keith and the others said to me that we looked at each other. They said, do you see that? One of them yelled, hey, you. And the figure turned and looked at them and then ran into the tree. And, this is in the middle of the hangar bay. There's not all this, subsequent to opening the museum, they put in a lot of planes and a whole bunch of other things in the hangar bay. There was nothing there. So they fanned out, they could not find anybody. So unless there was some sort of secret portal in the tree, this guy was gone. Another incident, several of them were on the hangar bay. They had been painting the floor of the hangar bay. And right at the entrance where visitors comes in, there is a ladder to the captain's area off to the right. So they had just painted the area by this ladder, the captain's ladder, and they were kind of painting parts of the hangar bay as they go along. They painted that area. They started walking away, and they heard footsteps on the ladder going up. Now, this place, the Hornet, was not open as a museum. Everybody was accounted for. And they turned and looked. There was no one there. They heard the footsteps going up the ladder, then coming down the ladder, and then coming on the deck towards them. Didn't see anything. Most importantly, because I asked this question, you could see footsteps like the Invisible Man walking across the floor, because it was fresh paint. Nothing. So that was a different kind of experience. And what we learned is that in general, most people, the witnesses, either saw sailors and officers, but didn't hear a sound, or heard sound like footsteps, banging on the ladders, things like that, but never saw anybody. And yet these things were still interactive that were happening. And then, of course, there were common reports in the ladies' room, which used to be an engine repair shop. Because when the ship was in operation, there was no ladies' room. There were no women aboard the ship, except for maybe visitors. So in the ladies' room, women were reporting, this was even before the place opened up, being pinched on the rear. And also looking in the mirror, every once in a while, they saw a man standing behind them, looking at them like with his hands on his hips, shaking his head like, what are you doing here? And occasionally they'd hear chains rattling as if there was still repair work going on there. And that pinching, that physical touch piece, was something that was reported a number of times. In fact, one of the investigations we actually did it with TLC, with the Learning Channel. And I brought aboard as an experiment 7 people who had never had a ghostly experience. Well, let's put it this way, not on the ship. They'd never even been on the ship. Half of them, I'd say 4 of them, had had an experience with another ghost in a different location, an apartment. So they had an experience. I wanted to see if they could pick anything up. And the other 3, nothing. They'd never really had an experience. So we walked them around the ship. I took them to places where most commonly the witnesses had reported seeing someone, and wanted to see whether or not anyone would pick up the same locations. Took them to a lot of other locations and asked them to mark down for each compartment we went into, are you picking anything up? As we were walking through the newly opened medical bay, because it hadn't been opened previously, my friends Jill and Travis were ahead of us, and Jill was right in front of me. Travis had actually started to fall back next to me. Jill was probably about 6 feet up in front of me, and she kind of like yelped and moved herself like she'd been touched or pinched on the rear. And she looked right at me and said, "Loyd." And both Travis and I looked at each other, and Travis said, "Well, he didn't touch it." So someone had interacted with her. The other multiple witness testimony reports came from typically 2 of the guys who lived aboard. Jim and Keith had a number of experiences. There were others who typically were with people. And what's interesting and most interesting about this case is in the situations where there were more people around, so more than one person around, everybody would see something, not just one of the 2 or one of the 5 or 2 of the 5. And that's extremely different than most circumstances. And yet, even though they're seeing the same thing, these things disappear. So clearly what looks like a physical person disappearing is clearly not a physical person. And again, there's recognition. One of the first experiences that I believe Keith and Jim had were, they were painting the floor of the forecastle, the forecastle area in the front of the ship. And behind them, there was just an overhang, which just went to the barracks, to some of the bunks. And they both felt like there was somebody looking at them. They were alone on the ship. This was late in the afternoon or evening. They were pretty much alone on the ship. They lived aboard the ship. And they're painting and painting and painting. And they felt like somebody was looking at them. So they turned around. In one direction, they could see 2 sailors. And they turned a little bit more, and they saw an officer. And the sailors disappeared. The officer waved at them when they waved, and then disappeared. And their first reaction, what they kind of kiddingly said, was they looked at each other and laughed because they said, "Oh, this must be paint fumes." But that was one of the first experiences they had. And then it proved out over time, short time, that they were going to have many more experiences like that.
Have you tried to communicate with any of these soldiers, sailors, officers on the ship? I mean, what things have they said to you through the medium or whatever?
Through the mediums that we brought in, starting with Stash, the purpose of their being there and why more, actually, we believe that more people came, more ghosts came after the initial opening of the museum. The reason they were there had little to do with dying aboard the ship. In fact, Clark did not die on the ship. J.J. Clark died after retirement. So did the chaplain. What the message we got was that they are there to protect the legacy of the Hornet, the legacy of the ship. Now, people may not be aware, but this ship in 1995, it was brought down from the shipyards in Bremerton, Washington, to Alameda for the closure of the Alameda Air Base. This is during the Clinton administration when a lot of bases were being shut down. The ship previously had been slated to be scrapped for $6 a ton. So this was the lead Pacific ship starting in 1943. Very historic. It's the ship that picked up Apollo 11 and 12. So that's kind of criminal to want to destroy something like that. So it was brought down, and because of its history, a foundation formed to save the ship in cooperation with the Navy. They basically leased it from the Navy. And prior to that, I was very fortunate a few years later, after I started investigating, I was on Coast to Coast, I think it was, and someone called in from the Bremerton shipyards after we talked about the Hornet and flat out stated the Hornet's not haunted. So I started asking questions. So I thought, well, this guy must be a skeptic. He and his dad actually worked the shipyards and maintained the ships. And as we're talking, he says, yeah, the Hornet's not haunted. My dad and I experienced nothing on the Hornet, but some of the sister ships, some of the other ships that are there are really haunted. So he was a believer. He had had a lot of experiences. So it's his thought, it seems like the Hornet wasn't haunted until it was brought down from Washington to Alameda. And then because it was dicey in terms of the negotiation to keep the ship and to set it up as a museum, apparently, according to the mediums who have spoken to these ghosts, they were attracted back to the ship to protect it, to help it along. We heard some wild stories about during the initial early years, some of the Foundation people and their encounters as well. So it seemed like they were there to ensure the legacy of the Hornet, the USS Hornet, was to continue. The history was to continue. And over time, that's the general message we've gotten every single time a psychic or medium has communicated with any of them. They all said that they were drawn back to the ship because it needed their protection, because it needed to be history. And the ship itself has a very positive feel to it. It doesn't feel like a ship of war at all. It has a real positive feel to it.
So another question comes to me, and it seems from these stories that these types of ghosts are aware of what's going on, what people are talking about, what people are planning. Do you have any idea how that works? Or are they just eavesdropping?
Well, I have to tell you that probably the most disturbing thing about ghosts, having a ghost in your house, has nothing to do with fear, or it should have nothing to do with being afraid. It might have something to do with privacy. Because technically they could be, peering in on us at any time. We would never know. On the ship, or in any of these cases, we find interaction where there's activity, where their interest is. I don't think, I've not seen any situation where the ghosts are all that interested in the day-to-day lives of everybody. But on the Hornet, apparently they do join in on meetings. Apparently they have their own meetings. A couple docents reported walking into a conference room and seeing a bunch of officers sitting there, and they were actually the spirits that they saw. And knowing that they couldn't bring the tour group in at that point, they had to back out. They would look back in and there's nobody there. So it's a really interesting factor. Apparitions, you have to think it's really important. And this is a missing piece from any of the TV shows, from people's understanding, from the majority of ghost hunters even having an understanding, unless they start looking into the field of parapsychology, which has been studying these things since the 1800s. And that is, ghosts don't have eyes and ears, physical eyes and ears. They can't see and hear the way we see and hear, because they have no retina that light can hit and they have no brain to process that. They have no eardrums, physical eardrums to react to sound. So they're perceiving us through, you might say, through ESP, through psychic senses. So it's not that they're reading our minds, they can pick up the information that way. They can perceive it possibly visually or auditorily or otherwise in their consciousness. But if they're interacting, if they're watching us, or if they're doing anything, they're connecting to the information that we're putting out to our actual physical presence. And yes, they could potentially follow us around and even watch us in the bathroom in the shower. But hopefully they're nice enough not to do that.
You've written a new book, or you're writing a new book?
I actually have a new book coming out called Near Death. It is subtitle is A Rainy Day Investigation. It is a fiction. It's my first foray into fiction with two other authors, Rich Hozek and Arnold Rudnick. And it's actually an adaptation of a TV pilot script, TV movie script that we wrote a number of years ago and tried to sell. We actually had some studios that were somewhat interested, but then the X-Files came along and we kind of went down. So we decided to turn our script and actually the storylines that we have, because we have a number of storylines, a number of mysteries, into a book series. So this is the first book, out October 1st, 2020, and the second novel should be ready to go in April. That's our shooting date for getting that book out. And the main character, or one of the two main characters, is quite a bit based in me. And of course, there are some actual cases in here and a little bit of real paranormal information throughout the book.
So where can people find this book?
So this book will be available on Amazon on October 1st. We're planning on being out there quite a bit with it in October.